And it's funny because people would be incredulous about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but yet they're convinced that the entire universe was smaller than the head of a pin, and for no reason that anybody's adequately explained to me. Makes sense.
Yeah. No.
Instantaneously became everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't buy that.
I'm sticking with Jesus on that one. Like, Jesus makes more sense.
Joe Rogan recently posted this video, or during a conversation, he talked about the miracle of the Big Bang and the miracle of the resurrection. So let's just dive right on in, shall we?
Joe Rogan, the most influential podcaster on planet Earth, just made a pretty surprising argument for Jesus, and it's gone viral. Take a look.
And it's funny because people would be incredulous about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but yet they're convinced that the entire universe was smaller than the head of a pin, and for no reason that anybody's adequately explained to me. Makes sense.
Yeah. No.
Instantaneously became everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't buy that.
I'm sticking with Jesus on that one. Like, Jesus makes more sense.
Billy.
It's really interesting to see the journey that Joe Rogan has been on in recent years. Here you have a guy who not that long ago was very vocally mocking religion, and particularly Christianity. The idea of a man rising from the dead and walking on water.
The whole thing's so stupid. Just stop and think how stupid that is. You understand, mother, because the New Testament is utter horse.
But now, over the years, I think in light of conversations with people like Jordan Peterson, although he, as far as we know, he definitely hasn't come out and proclaimed a clear-cut biblical Christian faith, but he had logical arguments for the existence of God that I think were pretty influential on Joe. And even now you see Jordan being a little more open with making some form of proclamation, but he's still not 100% clear, unless there's been something out that I didn't see. And he recently had Wes Huff on, and it wasn't an adversarial argument. It was just an honest engagement where he just asked a lot of questions. So I said a few years ago, it might have been 2-3 years ago, where I said that in 5 years, Joe is going to make some profession of faith. Now, I don't know what, but he seems to be a man that's searching for answers. And he's really being challenged on the claims of evolution, something that many of the guys that have been on the show have been advocates of, people like Sam Harris over the years. He's had Richard Dawkins on throughout the years. And something's going on with Joe. I think those of us that are believers, we need to keep praying for the man.
About that comment.
I mean, the entire conversation that he had was fascinating. I think the comment itself is very telling, because this is a guy who, as far as we understand, I believe he's described himself as at some points an atheist, at least agnostic, but yet he's having all these conversations about faith lately. And so to see somebody who you assume didn't believe actually make a comment about Jesus Christ and the resurrection being more believable than some of these other things like the Big Bang, that's a pretty incredible statement for somebody like him with the influence he has to be making.
And he's having a bunch of apologists on his show, like Wes Huff. And so, Joe, if you're watching this, let me recommend a few names. Not that I necessarily endorse every argument that they've ever made, but someone like a William Lane Craig, John Lennox, James Torr, Sean McDowell, Michael Icona.
Let me know what you think. William Lane Craig, he makes some good arguments as far as a cumulative case for God. He makes good arguments for the defense of the New Testament. He makes good arguments for reason and logic and things like that. But he really miffs it, I think, on his perspective on Genesis. He takes a lot of secular perspectives that I'm just not a fan of, that seem to stray very far away from the clear teaching of the Bible. And some of the guys he mentioned, I love John Lennox. I'm a fan. And I think he's been a gift to the church. And of course, like I said, not everybody you're going to agree with, but I think that there are other people Joe could have on. Now, I would personally love to see him have like a Jason Lyle, Dr. Jason Lyle, a Dr. Jonathan Sarfati. Those are the guys that I would love to see go on Joe Rogan, because I think they make a consistent biblical case for Genesis, for creation in general. They have a deep, rich scientific background. And I think for a guy like Joe, who's into the more intellectual side of things, I think those guys would be really cool. It would be a really cool breath of fresh air to see those guys on, just to have a nice, well thought out conversation on these issues.
Let's have them on your show, brother. Because here's my encouragement, my man. I'm a natural skeptic, and my path to having my doubts answered was more of the archaeology side of it, which I will get to in a second. But if your holdup is science, man, there's a lot of good stuff in there. This is a big book. This is not an endorsement, but just to have it. This book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh and Sean McDowell. If you're watching this and you're not even, a believer by any means, this is a good place to start. It's kind of long, but it's some good stuff in there. And so my encouragement to my friend here who's watching is that I know, let me say it this way. It's all true. There really was a person named Jesus of Nazareth. He really did live in a very real place. He was born in Bethlehem. He really was crucified. All the names in the Bible, the goalpost for faith has been moved so much where people used to say, oh, this is all fairy tales. You can't prove any of it. And then like every 5 seconds, they're finding something in the ground in Israel where it's like, so I guess Hezekiah was a real dude. King David, real guy. All these places, real. There's a YouTube channel, Billy, that I love called Expedition Bible, if you're really into archaeology. But we're talking about science. We're talking about the Big Bang. Billy, what would you say if you could talk to Joe right now when he's kind of on this precipice of seeing the validity of the Christian argument?
Let me ask you this. What was convincing for you, those of you who are watching that are believers? What convinced you that the Christian faith was real? For me personally, it was the inner testimony. That was one of the biggest aspects, the inner testimony of my heart, just a conviction of sin. That was a massive part for me. But then once I started digging deeper, it's funny that he brings up Josh McDowell, the very first apologetics book I ever bought. When I was working at the prison in Westville Correctional Center, there was an inmate who had a book called A Ready Defense, which is basically a compilation of books by Josh McDowell. I think More Than a Carpenter and a few other books. I think the original version of Evidence That Demands a Verdict, they were all in there. But as time went on, then I was really convinced by the presuppositional argument that basically says without God, the God of the Bible, you can't prove anything. And then how that's hashed out, how God is a necessary precondition for the God of the Bible, not God in general, but the biblical God is a necessary precondition for intelligibility. For us to be able to make sense of the world, the foundation, this very starting point, has to be the God of Scripture. And I think those were the most compelling arguments for me that convinced me. Now, I had already believed when it came down to from an evidential perspective. I think there are some strong arguments to be made. But as far as what really solidified and strengthened my faith the most, it was a presuppositional argument. But let me know what really drove you to truly believe that Christianity is true.
Yeah, I would say keep digging. I mean, the fact that here's the interesting thing. Very few people go back. I mean, there are lots of debates about the Big Bang, but the fact he was going back to the moment, of the creation in which we are living was actually very interesting. And I would tell him to keep moving forward and look at the different pieces, but he already seems to be doing that. I mean, the fact that he's juxtaposing the Big Bang against the resurrection, this idea that we came from nothing. One of the things, just to mention this, because I think it's important, when you're talking to atheists and agnostics, they will often say, oh, okay, great. Well, where did God come from then, right? It's sort of this, like, they think it's a checkmate argument. But the reality is, obviously, we have human minds and they're limited in how we think. And Rogan even said this. He said, we're born and we die. Maybe we're placing biological limitations on our understanding of the universe because we assume everything is created and dies.
Another good point. When we look at naturalism as opposed to a supernatural existence, it's like this. And this is one thing that I bring up when I'm having conversations with non-believers. One of many points I bring up. If you take something like your cell phone, if someone told you that our cell phone, this was a product of time and chance over billions and billions of years, the plastic, the metal, the glass, all of it, all the information in it came together over billions and billions of years. And now I'm using this cell phone. Would you believe it? And 10 out of 10 times I've ever asked any non-believer, professing non-believer, if they would believe that, they laughed. They would always laugh and say, no, I wouldn't believe that. And I'm like, well, why not? If you don't want to go with the argument of the cell phone for whatever reason, let's just say any book you have that has words in it. If someone was to argue that this book came about as a result of time and chance acting on matter over millions or billions of years, would you believe it? The sentences, the punctuation, everything. The fact that you can make out these sentences into coherent paragraphs and chapters. And they always agree that it's nonsense. But yet here we have our bodies, or just anything living in nature especially, that is far more complex than the cell phone, far more complex than a book. Every cell that exists inside our body is far more complex than a book or a cell phone. But yet somehow we're under the impression that these things came about over chance happenings, as a result of chance, where there was no intention, no mind, no intelligence behind it. I honestly believe when the scripture says that professing to be wise, they became fools, or that the non-believer literally suppresses the truth in unrighteousness. I think that hits the nail on the head 100%, because no rational being would believe that such a high level of complexity would ever be able to be brought about without intelligence being behind it. And on top of it, here's another point. If you look at the cell phone or your computer or whatever, believing that it created itself. No, it would have to be the cell phone comes together because an intelligent force acts that exists outside of the cell phone and creates it. I put a puzzle together. I'm not a part of the puzzle. I'm an intelligent individual to some degree, acting on the puzzle pieces and bringing them all together. Or the concept of the supernatural as opposed to naturalism, a force that acts outside of nature, that creates. That is the biblical claim. At its very base level, that is the biblical claim. That is not irrational. That is common sense. So I'm making a very basic argument, but I wish more people would be honest about the reality and stop suppressing these truths.
God could have always just been there. But the point is, both sides have that argument, because where did this little thing come from that sparked everything? Where did all of that come from? Right?
If you're watching this, I might step on some toes here, Billy. If you're watching this, you believe in miracles. What do I mean by that? You either believe in the virgin birth of Jesus or the virgin birth of the entire universe, or another religion. But my point being is this. The idea that everything came from nothing doesn't make logical sense. And so people will say, well, what about, dark energy?
Now, the Big Bang idea acknowledges this, and ideas like the multiverse only put the beginning more remotely, but don't get rid of the pesky problem.
Yeah, the Big Bang attempts to explain the beginning of the universe, but what did it begin from, and what caused it to begin? Ultimately, it couldn't have come from a matter-energy source, the same sort of stuff as our universe, because that matter-energy would also be subject to the same physical laws and would therefore decay. It would have to have a beginning too, just further back in time.
Yeah, so the atheist answer is it had to come from nothing.
Yeah.
Okay, so nothing became everything with no cause whatsoever. I'm not making this up, by the way. This was actually proclaimed on the front cover of Discover magazine back in April of 2002. It says, the universe burst into something from absolutely nothing, zero, nada. And as it got bigger, it became filled with even more stuff that came from absolutely nowhere. How is that possible? Ask Alan Guth. His theory of inflation helps explain everything.
Wow, that is quite the theory. Physicist Lawrence Krauss, one of the loud new atheists, has tried to explain how everything came from nothing, even wrote a book about it. Yeah. But what he calls a nothing is it's a quantum vacuum, which is not actually nothing. A matter, energy, quantum something has exactly the same problem as an eternal universe. It cannot have persisted for eternity in the past. So all their theorizing only applies after the universe, which is obviously something, exists.
Your gravity, dark energy and gravity, that's not nothing.
Right.
And so to me, you believe that that trillions of stars just blasted into existence from nothing. To me, that screams like a bigger miracle. People used to say, the old people, centuries ago, would look up at the night sky and see these dots in the sky and be like, well, there must be a God. But now that we have all this crazy technology and we can realize that there's billions of galaxies, trillions of stars, an unfathomable universe where we can't even begin to describe it, I don't know which one is a harder miracle to believe. So to me, I actually think the burden is on us. Now that we can see into the universe, it screams, to me at least, more of a creator than when we used to look up in the night sky and see dots in the sky. I think that's scriptural. I want to leave you with one Bible verse. It comes from Ecclesiastes 3:11. And I think if you're watching this and you're struggling with your faith, I get it. I've been there. But I think you're closer to God than you realize. My buddy Joe, you're watching this, my man. God's after you, brother. And Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, among other things, but he says, he has also set eternity in the human heart. Man, whenever I try to run away or think myself out of belief, there's something in my heart that screams of eternity, because I think God put it in there. So Billy, I'll give you the last word on this pretty amazing statement by Joe Rogan.
Yeah, it's the God-shaped hole that we hear a lot about, that we all have, and we're all trying to figure out how to fill that. And I think when you look at the universe, not only can something come from nothing, we know that that's not possible, but for it to be orderly, right? This idea that it would happen, the Big Bang, and that everything would be orderly and it would expand and we would be floating around on this planet as human beings with animals and trees and everything working in perfection. It's nonsensical. But I would just leave you with this. I would leave people with the idea that when an atheist or an agnostic says, well, where did God come from? The answer is, well, where did the materials to create the Big Bang come from? Both sides have the same problem. I think one side makes much more sense, the order and the intent that God created everything with. That is the side that actually has the facts on it, as you were stating, Raj. So we can leave it there today.
Yeah, I think obviously I agree. I think he made a sound case. I don't think it's a problem, the idea of an extremely powerful, all-knowing, intelligent being who exists outside of nature and creating time and space out of nothing. Supernatural, as opposed to nothing being the creative force. I don't think that's an issue whatsoever on the part of the believer. But let me know what your thoughts are. Give me a comment down below or comment in the chat if you're watching this live.